We all got into the tabletop RPG hobby for different reasons. For some, it's socialization, and others like to play powerhouse characters. And for some, it's just really relaxing. There's loads of joy to being in this hobby. There's also a lot of pain, and a lot of funky history and problematic history and present that people have to deal with. And when you bring in the socio-political aspects and all the drama that has existed in the TTRPG hobby, then, well, it gets a little bit more messy. And in the case as a black person who is a nerd and who plays in the TTRPG hobby and who has been in the hobby for 5 years, I have somewhat of a jaded experience, but also positive. So for this Black History Month, I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to both be black, queer, and a nerd in the TTRPG hobby. And to start off that conversation, let's talk about the historical landscape of RPGs like D&D and how race and racism were involved. Nerd culture is for everyone. No one should be ostracized or be treated poorly because of who they are. And I know this sounds very generic and humpty-dory, but it's the truth. But we also need to acknowledge that socio-political issues do in fact affect our hobby and influence our games. And nerd culture is no exception to the socio-political drama of things such as race, racism, and other forms of bigotry and oppression. I think TTRPGs and nerd culture is made for a lot of people, and you can describe yourself as you see fit. I describe myself as a nerd. However, I would still say to this day that nerd culture is seen as a white hobby, or a white thing. Nerds were, and to some degree, folks who did not engage in cultural practice that were deemed popular. You know, think back in high school or middle school where sports or being the popular kid were more important. Things such as video games or nerdy science stuff were just seen as otherized. You were treated poorly for that. Nerdiness, I think, is a subculture defined by being whiter than white, quote unquote. To quote Buchholz in his article, The Whiteness of Nerds, he states, "This identity, the nerd, is racially marked precisely because individuals refuse to engage in cultural practices that originate across racialized lines and instead construct their identities by cleaving closely to the symbolic resources of an extreme whiteness." How I'm understanding this line is that due to a nerd's specific interests, they are an outcast, which I think we can agree to, by the greater community of, well, whiteness, and instead form their own insular community that's related around generally more geeky or nerdy things. And I think this holds a bit true. Let's do a thought experiment. Think about the nerdiest thing you could think of. Think of the group. Think of the people in that. What kind of people do you see in your head, do you think of? Think about an anime convention or a TTRPG convention. What are the demographics? Who are the people you think of? Next, let's look at some specific examples from, well, your favorite TV shows. Think of the nerd archetype. Who do you usually see? Now, let me be clear, there are plenty of black nerdy characters. In fact, TV Trope has a whole trope on black nerds because they've existed, and they do exist. But typically when you think of a nerd, you think of, well, white folk who don't really have much redeeming attributes other than, well, they're smart or geeky or they have a particular interest, and they're usually not very pretty. What I'm trying to say is that nerd culture and nerdiness is prescribed as a white thing because media representation and our own perceptions have made it that way. There's a reason why, well, you don't see as many black nerds in, well, nerdy spaces. It's a combination of, well, demographics and just accessibility and also gatekeeping that's happened in part in nerd culture. So it's not a shocker that nerdy communities have a stigma of being seen as white because, well, gatekeeping, a combination of demographics, access, and, well, general representation would make that otherwise just not fun to be around. RPGs, and specifically, well, nerdy topics like tabletop role-playing games, have often been a white quote-unquote thing. And now let me be clear, that isn't saying black folk don't play these games, but it is making a point that it's prescribed as a white nerdy thing rather than just something that is a nerdy thing that anyone can join. So, we know that D&D's influence definitely pulled from Tolkien. Tolkien, as you know, created Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which were super influential fantasy books and, well, then movies. However, how Tolkien wrote about orcs and its moral geography in the books and movies is somewhat not pretty. So we know that Gondor and the Elf Nation are located on the west, while Mordor, the realm of orcs, is located on the east. This is a moral geography that is kinda screwy. Specifically about the orcs, Tolkien wrote in a private letter, if I'm correct, they are squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the least lovely Mongol types. Side note, I am aware that Tolkien fought in 2 world wars and definitely hated Nazis. We know that. All of us know that. But people are products of their time, history, and geography and their politics. So we can also still be critical of the things Tolkien has written, and specifically the things that D&D and Wizard of the Coast have done, while also enjoying the things we like TTRPGs. In fact, Robert Stewart mentions in his book, Tolkien, Race and Racism in the Middle-earth, Tolkien's legendarium is suffused with racialist imagery and at times imbued with racist values. All that is saying is that while Tolkien was a generally awesome author, he is a product of his, environment. And he has said some pretty problematic stuff that would subsequently influence how races such as the orcs were developed in D&D. For Drow, the biggest issue you can find is that a group of dark-skinned elves are naturally gravitating towards evil, in contrast to their lighter-skinned elves, is kinda screwed up. And while we can't say, oh, it's fantasy, we can just make things up, the brute character of, the black or brown person being violent is a stereotype that's given to black folk and brown people. Fortunately, D&D has addressed this issue in several ways, but I'm not going to go into detail on about how they've addressed it. We know that they have. What matters is that this is some of the background on why maybe people don't get into RPGs, and also why the RPG hobby is predominantly white. This isn't getting into the virtual rise of the far right in TTRPG spaces, which John Battle made an amazing video on, so go check it out. What I am trying to say is that there's a presence of racism and certainly anti-black racism with TTRPG spaces, especially when you look at the history and the gatekeeping that general nerd culture has done. So a combination of all of these issues might be the reason why there's a lack of diversity and a lack of black and brown TTRPG designers, gamers, game masters, and etc. in your space, whether it's virtual, at an event, or otherwise. Another facet I think that needs to be addressed is that there is an issue specifically on the company-facing side of things in terms of race and, socio-political issues. Let's start off with Wizard of the Coast. Wizard of the Coast in recent years has deeply screwed over freelancers and past employees and has been a hostile work environment. There are a lot of reports about racist incidents, underpaid workers, freelancers having their work stolen. For instance, Orion Black's statement saying how his work environment was awful, he felt like he was disregarded, and his work was stolen, and also how freelancers are exploited within the Wizard of the Coast ecosystem. And this isn't the only incident, with other really unsettling stories from other employees. What about Paizo, who's lauded as a champion of the OCR? Well, they are not innocent either. And to be clear, we should be critical of all companies, because at the end of the day, their goal is to make money. As Jean Battle said in an article about the OCR issue, when in reality, all decisions made by a business are done for the righteous, capitalistic pursuit of money. Anyhow, ex-Paizo employees have alleged hostile work environments as well as racist and anti-LGBTQ executive board members. Some issues have related to, executive board member having a swastika on their Facebook page, or allegations of, the president bullying female staffers, and there have been accusations of anti-gay statements and anti-trans statements, which, to say the least, is kinda really unfortunate with, how much representation there is in, Paizo's Pathfinder 2nd edition. And this is scratching the surface of accusations, mistreatment, and what seems like a really shitty environment. This isn't talking about how Paizo employees are fighting for a union because of how crappy the work environment is. And the hardest thing to swallow for me, and I'm sure for many other minority creators, and of course Black TTRPG creators, By virtue of being a minority, our pain matters less. Or it feels like it does. It feels like the community cares about us less. From discussions on, orcs and the problematic history that they have or drows, to the concerning rise of the alt-right in the TTRPG space, and concerning some of the really crappy business practices that have happened at Wizards of the Coast, Paizo, and I'm sure has happened in other TTRPG companies. It feels like I'm fighting an uphill battle. However, I don't think that we should just throw in the towel and be okay with mediocrity, that we should be okay with feeling like crap, and that we should just be okay with being treated awfully. No, people should be able to tell their stories the way they see fit. Because I love role-playing games. Role-playing games helped me get out of some really bad times and helped me figure myself out, helped me explore awesome topics on sex, gender, and really awesome socio-political topics, and I also just had a really good time getting into the hobby. But we need to be aware of these issues. And next, sit with discomfort, deal with discomfort, acknowledge why do you feel discomfort or uncomfortable when we bring up issues on race, racism, and clear problems that affect minority TTRPG creators, gamers, and GMs. But remember that the pain is not necessarily there to make you feel like a villain or a victim. Rather, the pain is your impetus to think and reflect and ultimately change your own individual behavior and subsequently influence the behavior of other creators, gamers, and everyone else. Next, this might seem simple, but support your Black, brown, and minority creators financially and or emotionally if you can. And also, players, game masters, and creators who are in privileged positions, call out shitty behavior. If someone's saying something really crappy about your character on the basis of their race and it's not a character specific thing, say something. If there's something that you said or you did in your game and you made someone uncomfortable, address it when you can. Do the work internally and try to create the community that you want to set an example for. And one more thing, don't just invite us to the table when you want us there or because of some arbitrary diversity quota. It's tokenizing and it's not helpful for anyone, especially if no one's getting paid for it. Just saying. To be Black in the RPG space is difficult. I don't see myself or folks who look like me often. I can see that the RPG space isn't really all the time made for me. I feel like I have to carve out my own space, and it is isolating to say the least. But I'll never stop playing RPGs. When I realized I could play the character I wanted to in the shape, size, body, race, and personality, I knew that I'd fallen in love and I was never going to go back. And that still holds to this day. No matter what system I play, I'm going to play a character that represents me. Whether they're Black or whether they are an orc or whether they are an elf, a sprite, or a cyberpunk freak, it doesn't matter. I play RPGs so that I can have a fun and amazing time and talk about cool topics if that's something that happens at our table. We should all be able to play the games we want, and creators should not have to worry about being treated like garbage. And the fact that we can't, or that it feels like it's a problem to do that, is an issue that we all have to contribute to fixing and resolving. And we can't fix that over one night. That's going to take probably generations, and I won't get to see the end of that story. What I do know is that if this video brought you something, then like this content and let me know how you felt down below in the comment section. Anyhow, I'm your average, everyday queer host and Black host, Blurry Disposition. Hope you all have an awesome Black History Month. Ciao.